opening with farce. That's a good way to tell a story. Actually, the first thing that I'm going to do is explain who we are and why we're here, because I'm hoping that the first thing you've noticed is that I'm not Adam Frost from The Guardian. My name's Emma Whitehead. I'm actually from an organisation called Graphic. Up until July the 2nd this year, we were from The Guardian digital agency, part of The Guardian newspaper here in the UK. But on July the 2nd, we were actually acquired by WPP. So we're now an independent agency working for Sir Martin Sorrell, I think is the best way of putting it. And my name's Emma Whitehead. I'm the managing director, and Tobias here is the creative director. So hopefully you'll get two quite different but complementary perspectives on what we're here to talk to you about. And what we're here to do is to try and persuade you that storytelling is absolutely at the heart of successful data visualization. The most beautiful interfaces, the most amazing visual design, the most incredible technology won't have the impact that you want it to have unless you build in storytelling at the heart of everything that you're doing. So in order to persuade you of that, we're going to try and cover a couple of questions for you. And they are, why do we tell stories at all? How do we tell stories? And then what value does storytelling have in the work that we do for our clients? How does it maximise the impact of what it is that we're doing? We'll try and be as practical as possible. The first thing that I wanted to do was to try and unpick this idea of why we tell stories. And Robert made a really, really good point in the earlier presentation, which is that stories help things stick. And that's a brilliant explanation. That's a brilliant one-sentence summary. But we're going to try and talk a little bit more about why stories help things to stick. Because if we investigate some of these basic truths, we'll probably end up learning some new things and understanding how we can improve what it is that we actually do. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is, why do we tell stories? Tobias and I are both English students, so we could waste the rest of your day telling you about why people tell stories, but we're going to concentrate on a few basic things. The first simple truth is that humans just can't bear randomness. We cannot bear the idea of a chaotic universe and there's no meaning. We need to impose meaning on anything, on our experience, on anything that we look at in the world. We have to see a pattern. Can't just be a random shape. That's clearly three birds. I don't know what anybody else would see in it. So it's crucial to understand that patterns is a compulsion that we have. We are compelled to see them everywhere. And story is one of those patterns. It's a structure that we try and impose upon the world to make sense of our experience. It's a very, very basic truth, but it's really important. That compulsion, though, can be a little bit dangerous, particularly in the world of big data that we're now living in, because you might be able to see lots of patterns. Unfortunately, the colours aren't coming up very well, but there may appear to be correlation between the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in and the number of people who've drowned in swimming pools, but there's definitely not causation between there, and actually it's not a correlation at all. So there is a temptation to see patterns when they're not really there, so you need to be reasonably careful about it. Essentially, though, storytelling is our natural state. That's what we're doing all the time. That's a very interesting insight, particularly interesting insight for an English student. But what does that actually mean? If we're all telling stories all the time, what makes one person a better storyteller than another? How do you get better at it if it's just your natural state? And I think one of the ways that we can unpick that is to think about the compulsions, the reasons that we do it, and the effect that that has on the audience that we're telling the story to, because I think that can help us to refine our techniques to a certain degree. So I think we haven't got enough time to go into some of the darker Jungian psychological aspects of assimilation, but we'll try and pick some of the key reasons that storytelling is important. The first example that we came across recently is scientists at Harvard and at the University of Virginia conducted an experiment recently in which they placed people into a room. They just sat them in a chair in a room and left them there. No stimulation at all, nothing. And what they discovered was something quite interesting, that a good proportion, a quarter of women and 2/3 of men, chose to actually administer a mild electrical shock to themselves rather than to sit in silence with no stimulation. They chose pain over nothing, which I think is a pretty interesting revelation. The simple truth there is that we get bored really easily, and we can't stand being bored, can't bear it. So if you've got a story to tell and an audience in front of you, you better tell an interesting story, because otherwise, in the most extreme cases, they're going to start self-harming. So you really need to get pretty good at it. So that obviously leads to the obvious question, which is why are human beings so weird? Why do we need this kind of constant stimulation? And actually, there's another recent study done by a kind of pioneer of neuroeconomics, a guy called Paul Zak. And he undertook an experiment to try and understand the physical effects of storytelling on brain chemistry. And he took a group of volunteers and they were given a series of facts about some activities that a couple of people undertook over a day. And then they were told a very basic story. It contained the same facts, the same characters, and he tracked the impact on the brain. And what he discovered was that during the storytelling, levels of cortisol, which is a chemical that helps you to concentrate and focus, they were increased. And also levels of oxytocin in the brain were also increased. That's a chemical that helps you to feel compassion, to feel engaged and connected to something. So storytelling helps you to concentrate and it helps you to engage with the information. That's the physical effect that it has on you. I think that's quite an important thing to try and remember. Another thing that storytelling helps you to do is it helps you to absorb vast amounts of information much more quickly. In the same way as when we're reading, we're not actually picking up each individual letter of every word, we're picking up the shapes of the words in order to absorb that language. Storytelling helps you to do the same thing. It helps you to give recognizable shape to certain pieces of information, and it helps you to absorb that information much more quickly. The same way as going up an escalator will take you up quicker than going in the stairs. So why is it important now? Why are we talking about this again now? As Robert mentioned, storytelling has been around for thousands of years. It clearly works. I've just given you some modern scientific evidence as to why it works. But why are we talking about it again now? And we're talking about it again now because of the proliferation of information in the world. We're living in the world of big data. It must be important because that comes with capital letters now, which is indication that it's definitely happening. And we believe that the use of storytelling, the use of data visualization, in fact, but storytelling at the heart of it, is the way to unlock the value in the huge volume of data that is being produced. Just since I've started speaking, huge volumes of data have been produced. They're currently being stored somewhere, waiting for someone to do something with them. Nobody quite knows what that is, but visualization and storytelling is a way of unpacking the value in those huge volumes of data. So the key is, you've got to tell a story to engage an audience. But the kicker is, you've got to tell a good story. It's the difference between telling any story and telling a story well. Online reading statistics will tell you that. The same story can be told several different ways in the same newspaper, and you will see the reading stats on them are unbelievably different. Recognizable forms will attract a bigger audience. The other useful example of this is we tend to do this at our masterclasses, is a bit of audience participation. Who here has heard of The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kidd? 2? Okay, I'm not going to ask you because that's unfair. Who's heard of Hamlet? Okay, tells you the difference. Same plot, same characters, same things happen. 2 people remember the Spanish tragedy, the rest of the people in this room remember Hamlet. So it's a pretty decent example of why good storytelling will make a very significant difference to the same set of facts. So hopefully Tobias is going to unpack some of that technique.
Well, I think where I want to start first, before I start talking about technique, is to actually talk a little bit about what we mean by story, because it gets bandied about a lot. And there are a lot of frequently quite heated discussions about storytelling. And I often become aware that actually they're more the case of misunderstanding, 2 people with completely different ideas of what a story is, than they are disagreements. So some sort of definition of terms might be in order. So at the Guardian masterclasses, my colleague Adam always asks the group what they think a story is. And he's asked this of groups of 20 to 30 people every month for the last couple of years. So I've heard a lot of answers to this question, and people always say the same things. It has a beginning, middle, and end. That's always the first answer. Someone always says that. It has structure, it has an order, it's a sequence of events. It has a point, someone always says, which slightly surprises me. It makes it sound like a sort of moral story, a fable, but actually I guess they're thinking about journalistic stories, data journalism, where we are trying to deliberately show a message. We're trying to tell people something. It has an emotional connection, something people always say. It has characters, it has suspense, tension. It involves us emotionally. And again, possibly thinking more about fiction, but also, certainly true of data journalism. You're trying to engage people with what you're showing them. What no one ever says, and I hope because it's obvious rather than because it's wrong, is that it has an audience. Stories have audiences. We tell stories to people, an audience. And I think this is a potentially problematic word because we have a rather 20th century idea of what an audience is. We think of people sitting quietly in chairs being broadcast at. And we've even repurposed this word user to try and think of a new kind of audience because that's not the experience we want in data visualization. We're showing people a data set to get them involved in it and hopefully, in an interactive, to start exploring it themselves and tell themselves stories. But that's the point. We're still having to show them, and we're still having to introduce them to the data. And we are having to treat them as an audience in order to make them into storytellers. So how do we do that storytelling? Well, at the end of last year, I went on holiday. And I went to Venice. This was a big deal for me because I'd never been to Venice before. So I did a lot of reading. I read Jan Morris's Venice biography, which is an amazing book, this intelligent, witty, insightful picture of a city. He dramatizes Venice, brings it to life for you, and gives you, as Emma was saying, this amazing ability to suddenly know very deep, gnarly details about Venetian history and Venetian character. But I wasn't visiting historical Venice. I was visiting 21st century Venice, so I also had a guidebook. I had Venice for Pleasure by J.G. Links, which is not just the best guidebook to Venice there is. It is probably the best guidebook to anywhere I have ever read. It's phenomenal. I'm not really supposed to be here to be doing book recommendations, but this book is fantastic. And J.G. Links, it's a book of walks. It's 5 walks over the course of a week, day-long walks. And he is a fantastic companion on a walk, urbane, witty, knowledgeable, as interested as where the next coffee is coming from as he is in Canaletto. And he provides this fantastic narrative structure to your experience of Venice, walking you from A to B to C, the Venice that he wants to show you. But that's the point. It's the Venice that J.G. Links wants me to see. And there are other Venices. So I also had a fairly conventional guidebook, which just had restaurants and museums in it, and it came with a tourist map, a highly simplified street map, with just highlighting the key bits, the Piazza San Marco, the Rialto Bridge, just so you know where the important things is, the things you really ought to see on your first visit to Venice. So not particularly useful as a street map, but providing an annotation to that street map to show you the highlights. So I also needed a street map. I am, by habit, what I like to think of as a flaneur, a boulevardier, what my friends like to think of as vague and easily distracted. I tend to wander. So I had a street map as well, a conventional street map with the name, the street's name, so I won't get lost. It doesn't work. You get lost in Venice. Fortunately, there are worse things than being lost in Venice, unless there is a little serial killer in a red Mac scurrying around. But again, a street map takes that complexity, the chaotic nature of Venice, with its cul-de-sacs and canals and the dark water lapping at the blind walls, and actually makes it vaguely navigable. It simplifies as it creates a visualization of that reality that helps us navigate. And all these representations of Venice have something in common. They are taking that raw nature of Venice and structuring it. And this is what I think story is. Story is meaningful structure, taking data, information, putting it in a structure that often itself has meaning. It is alphabetized or arranged in geographical coordinates, but also, more importantly, allows the audience to find meaning in that structure. And this is what all those traditional definitions of story are. You know, the Sid Field Save the Cat, Aristotle's Unities, Matt Stone and Trey Parker's Therefore and However, that a story is not and then and then and then. A story is therefore this, however that, therefore this. Cause and effect. Meaningful structure. The journalist's 7 questions. The salesman's Aida. These are all about structuring information. My colleague Alan talks about selection and emphasis, selecting content and then choosing to emphasize it in a particular order, parts of that content, in order to create a structure that has meaning for your audience. And this is the key. These things happen in conjunction with the audience. So that with a street map, you start the story and they complete it. They walk from Piazza San Marco to the Rialto Bridge by way of the Arsenale if I'm in charge. With annotation, we start to guide them a lot more. We start to show them, as with that tourist map, we think that these are the more interesting ways in which to explore this information. With narrative, we tell them how to explore the information. We give them a definite structure for reading this data. And with drama, we go somewhere else. We start to involve their imagination and their emotions in dramatic structure. John le Carré says that the cat sat on the mat is not a story. The cat sat on the dog's mat is a story, because it sets up expectations and tension and interest and engagement. And so this is how we tell a story. We arrange information in a structure, in a meaningful structure. And fortunately, this is what we do in data visualization. We take raw data and we arrange it in a visual structure to help our audience find meaning in it. That is the purpose. What this means is when we go about doing that, when we go about representing data, when we go about charting, we are engaging in storytelling. It might just be at the level of that street map, starting the story. But a street map encourages an audience to see, you know, the street names of Venice arranged geographically, encourages the audience to see a very different story to the street names of Venice arranged alphabetically. A bar chart encourages them to see a very different story to a pie chart. And this is not just happening in the charting. This was a genuine piece of feedback that we got from a client this week. This was about the 8th round of amends on an infographic, and my patience was already wearing thin. And he sent back a PowerPoint slide with 2 little pie charts in it, covered with notes. And in the email said, please include the pie charts, but please note they do not show any data. They are just symbols for the facts. What a great phrase. I think we've just discovered a new definition of language. Needless to say, he did not get what he wanted. I just want to reassure you. Now, obviously, to a purist, pie charts are useless anyway. We cannot discern any meaningful value out of a pie chart. They're just meaningless decoration. But I would argue there is no such thing as meaningless decoration. Everything that we do visually in data visualization, our audience will be looking for meaning. If I had included those symbolic pie charts, the audience would have tried to investigate them for the values they represented. They would have assumed that they had meaning. Everything decorative we do, all that stuff that Scott McCloud calls visual persuasion, that stuff that persuades our audience to want to read and to carry on reading, is also a tool for comprehension, so that a map, a little bit of decoration becomes a key, becomes an annotation layer in the colours that guide the audience through reading different stages of a story, different parts of different data sets arranged down a page. And this becomes even more important the more complex the data sets we're dealing with become. I was reading a blog post by someone the other day who was talking about that delicious moment of delight when you show someone a visualization and they look at it and they look a bit harder and their brow begins to furrow and they step back and they hold it upside down and slowly the light dawns. And I thought, what kind of sadist are you? The whole point of data visualization is to make things easier for people to understand, not harder. Why are you showing people incomprehensible things? You are doing it wrong. And this is where we need to start thinking about narrative structure, not necessarily a narrative structure for the content, but a narrative structure for the experience, how we walk an audience into understanding. It's something we do very naturally in interface design. We think about that user experience and how people move through the affordances that interface affords them. But we also need to be thinking about how we arrange that visually, how we help the audience understand the relationships and the information hierarchy and what they're shown. And what this requires is a sort of consistency of contrast, a consistency of change. We need visual distinction in order to call out individual elements and make it plain what the hierarchy is, but we need to use those consistently so our audience can follow how we're talking and concentrate on what we're saying. But of course, that visual change and visual contrast does more than that. It's what makes things interesting for a start. It's what makes things visually persuasive and beautiful. But it is also what makes things dramatic. It is that visual contrast that allows us to create dramatic structure, to involve our audiences in interest and surprise and change and drama. Because this is what's going to get them most involved with the stories. And this is where walking the audiences into the story with drama is what gets them to the data engaged and curious and ready to tell their own stories. I'll hand back to that.
I think that concentration on audience is absolutely vital. You need to think about the audience that you're working with, or the audiences. That's normally the first challenge that we have with people that we work with, is they tell us they have a single audience who all want the same thing. It's very unlikely. And most likely you are trying to fit a square peg into a round hole at that point. So part of our mission when we do this is to try and triangulate between the audience, the content, and the channels that are available, because that will help you to choose how to tell the story to different audiences. And interactive is certainly a fabulous way. To go back to actually the New York Times example that was used earlier on, that's a fantastic example because that works for lots of different audiences. The really surface audience is just going to look at the line that's highlighted and see that as a story. That's a story. It's telling you that story. Some people will think, oh, I'm quite interested, I'm quite intrigued by this, I'm going to go on and explore. But what we've found is it's very rare that people will go straight to exploration without a story. So think about your audiences, think about how engaged they are before you come up with the solution, because otherwise you're trying to engineer the audience around your solution to the problem. So we talk about audience and we think about why it's crucial to reach them. What is it that our clients generally are trying to do? And they're trying to do normally one of three things. They're trying to reach an audience larger than the one they already have. They're trying to engage an audience in a very specific point and make a very particular impact on them. Or they're trying to get that audience to pass it on, to try and increase their audience. And in order to focus our work, we need to understand what one of those things, or what combination of those things our clients are trying to come up with. Now, I'm going to try and show you a couple of examples, and at the same time, what I'm going to try and talk about is some of the key things about data visualization, about why it is as powerful as it is. We use 3 principles to identify data visualization, or good data visualization. It needs to reveal an insight that wouldn't normally be simple for people to see. Tobias's point about simplifying things. It needs to engage an audience in a subject that they wouldn't normally be interested in. And it needs to make that conclusion or that insight easily transferable beyond that first audience. If it isn't doing one of those 3 things, it's probably a redundant but very attractive illustration to whatever it is that you're doing. It's not actually an effective data visualization. So if we take a few examples, and I'll try and show you the impact that storytelling has when you do it right. So the first example is an example of trying to unpack and trying to increase interest in a subject with an audience that wouldn't normally be interested. So this is a piece of work we did for a big brewing company that wanted to talk about sustainability. It wanted to show thought leadership around a particularly complex piece of sustainability thinking, which is called nexus thinking. I won't try and interest you in this particular subject. But we put together an animation, a very, very structured narrative. You couldn't explore, you were told the story through the data that was provided to us. We produced this animation. They put it on their own YouTube channel. They got well in excess of 75,000 views on their YouTube channel, which is a pretty significant viewing rate. They got it syndicated out to multiple media channels right around the world. We got feedback on this from Australia. And then finally, the UN used it, asked them whether they could use this animation as the centrepiece of their UN Water Week campaign. So you can imagine a large brewing company is pretty happy with that kind of engagement with wider audiences. So you will have an impact, you will reach more people if you tell a story effectively. We talk about engaging audiences in subjects that they wouldn't normally be interested in, or in fact, gaining the attention of an audience that has a notoriously low attention span. This is an interactive that we built for a big market research firm that was trying to engage with media buyers and media planners. This is an audience that is notorious for having an incredibly short attention span, but there's a huge amount of data in this interactive. And because we structured it in a particular way, there were ways in which you could just see the surface stuff, you were told a story, and then you were invited to explore. You could just go through and pick out the story, be told the story all the way through. But you could also dig in and investigate a little bit more. Variegation within the audience. We know the audience has a short attention span. Some will have more attention than others. Some will have more engagement than others. So the audience reaction to this was actually fantastic. And they did manage to reposition themselves with a particularly critical audience. Interestingly, this came back to us from Google, actually. Google said it completely changed the way that they thought about this particular company because they actually thought about telling a story rather than just dumping their data on an audience, which would be their normal approach. Finally, we also talk about engagement and helping people to dig more deeply into things. So this is an interactive that we built for NatSem, the National Centre for Social Research, who actually are an organisation who have the most extraordinary data. I mean, the data in and of itself is fascinating. However, if you invited the great UK population to investigate a data set, I'm pretty sure that 95% of them would say, no, I don't really want to do that, thanks. So we knew that they wanted to engage a wider audience, and we also knew that they had an expert audience that would be interested in being engaged more deeply. So we had to think about a couple of different approaches. One of the measures that they gave us, the first thing that we ask most of our clients is, how are you going to measure the success of whatever project that we do for you? And the first measure that they gave us was traffic to their website. We want more clicks on our website. Okay, that's fine. If you want clicks, we'll give you something that some people will click on, send to their friends, and never look past. This is a slider, goes back and forth. The right-hand side is 2013, left-hand side being 1983. So, for example, I can't remember their names. William and Kate, that's it. They changed to Charles and Diana, etc. as you slide across. The trouble we actually had with this was we discovered that teenagers in 1983 dressed exactly the same as teenagers in 2013. You couldn't actually tell the difference. But anyway, so we knew that quite a lot of people would come, play with the slider, go, oh, that's cool, and then click away. So that gives them their traffic. But we also persuaded them that that was not the most natural tool to measure engagement in their website. Just clicks alone. If you could see the top 10 in The Guardian, you would find out that clicks is not a very good way of understanding the quality of the content that people are reading. If you want clicks, there are ways of getting clicks, which we did. We persuaded them that actually dwell time was the way to measure the success of this, how long people were spending on their website. And we knew that what we were going to have to do was structure a story so that we touched again on that very surface audience, and then we invited people to explore. So, key headlines at the top. just picking out the really big stories in the data. Then inviting you to have a look at the graphs. There are ways to turn those filters on and off. And then if you really want to get into it, you can download the data. And you can see, actually, this is a scrolling site. So actually, you have to go further into the site the more engaged you want to be. So there is actually an effort involved in order to get there. So think about those different audiences and the way that you're going to tell the story to them. Making an insight easily recognisable. Well, this is a piece of work that we did for Lloyd's of London a couple of years ago. And there's a huge amount of data in there. It's a very, very complex story. Actually, that's just a chapter of the story. We did a series of about 15 or 20 infographics with the shared visual language across all of them, so you started to recognise key insights. The key insight that you're going to recognise from this is that China has a huge insurance gap. So this is the same visual language. This is the insured loss, and then this piece is the uninsured bit. And then you can see at the top, China has a very, very different approach to insurance to the USA. It's a pretty easy insight. It's easily picked up. Got on. Then there is this increasing the audience or passing on the conclusion to a wider audience. We did this piece of work for The Lancet, actually a couple of weeks ago. It's telling a story with data. It is a compelling and interesting story. There's no getting around it. The subject matter is very interesting. But we've told it in it's a very traditional story structure, asking people what they expect and then confounding their expectations. So one assumes a series of myths about sex workers and HIV, and then the truth is revealed to them. So it's really not a very complex piece of work, but it's telling a very interesting story and it's opening that subject up to a wider audience. It was produced for The Lancet. It was also produced actually for a big conference in Australia, but it also got picked up by Wall Street Journal, and then it appeared on this site, Upworthy. I don't know whether any of you know about Upworthy. It's kind of BuzzFeed for the socially engaged, I think is probably the right way of putting it. So that is huge. I hate to use the phrase, but that is huge viral spread. And that's word of mouth in the modern world. So if you tell an interesting story, the chances are you'll engage with your audience, you'll get your insight landed more quickly, and you will increase your share of audience. And all of those things are things that our clients are coming to us and asking us to do. If you get it right, you actually will do either one of those things or hopefully all of those things. So I hope that's I hope we've kind of kept you engaged through 20 minutes and that none of you are starting to self-harm. So take questions.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks very much. In scientific visualization, we sometimes make a distinction between exploring the data when the scientist has got a load of data dumped on him from his model or his experiment or something like that, and he's trying to find out what's actually going on inside there. And then once he's got the insight, he wants to communicate that thing that he's discovered to his co-workers in a publication or something like that. So the difference between exploratory visualization, which I guess in your analogy would be the whole map of Venice, and then trying to guide people towards some conclusion that he has reached, which I guess in your analogy would be a route through Venice. Do you want to comment on the distinction between those two, if you can see it, and the role of storytelling in each of those? Thank you.
They're definitely very different, and certainly the biggest errors I see when clients come to us with stuff that isn't working is that they've used the charting they've used for analysis to try and communicate, and it never works because you understand all the intricacies of the stuff you're using for analysis. I think one of the things that I'm very keen on people understanding is that even in that charting for analysis, you are telling yourself a story. You are the audience, and the visual language you use to chart will influence the way you think about the data. You cannot escape that because you are human, and that is how you think. So you need to understand how that storytelling works in order to kind of step around it and make sure you're seeing through what the visualization may do to skew the raw data. But they're definitely different, and I think they have to be different. You have to understand how to do it.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Hill from the University of Leeds. You said that in your research, most people don't explore data, the visualization without a story. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about the research that you've done on that.
That was your claim.
That was my claim. Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure.
That would be down to some of the usage stats that we used to be privy to at the Guardian, and that we are privy to on quite a lot of the, particularly the interactives that we do for our clients. So we're able to tell where people drop out of particular interactives. And we can make reasonable assumptions about the proportions of people who are getting through certain stages. If we had more time and our clients have more budget, we would probably prototype that with them and test them with specific audience groups. Mainly it's extrapolation from a combination of the work that we're doing, and we used to have access to the Guardian's data, but we used to have to be incredibly careful about using Guardian analytical data, because I think the thing that some people in our position suggest is that data visualization can make anything interesting to anyone, and that's not true. The Guardian will probably have a better engagement with certain audiences because it's dealing with more interesting subjects and perhaps more diverse audience. To go back to actually that science analogy, we got asked a really interesting question by people at UCL about presentation to other academics, and our answer was don't do it. Don't use data visualization. You don't need to attract the audience.
In a storytelling.
Yeah. You don't need to engage. The audience is already attracted to the subject. They already understand the subject quite well, and the minute you start to make it look fancy, they're going to distrust it. So it's quite difficult to take those Guardian analytics because engagement with a story about Gaza is very different to engagement with a story about the use of multiple devices across different European countries. So I would not suggest we had done rigorous peer-reviewed research, but our experience is definitely, if you plunge straight into exploration, you lose quite a lot of people either at the top of the page or in the first step, in the first transition through the interactive.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, thank you.